True Akai, anyone tells you that a homeowners association is just a group of neighbors trying to keep the community looking nice. Let me tell you about the summer I accidentally became the man who shut off water to 38 families without touching a single valve. The funny part is that I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to collect rain that fell on my own roof. But somehow that turned into lawyers, deputies, angry meetings, and one HOA president crying in my driveway while asking me to save the very people who had spent months trying to punish me. My name is Daniel Carter, and about 3 years ago, I bought a small ranch-style house in a subdivision called Mesa Ridge, a quiet place sitting in the middle of high desert country where every blade of green grass exists only because somebody pays dearly to keep it alive. Most people who move there fall in love with the sunsets, the red cliffs, and the silence, but I noticed something else almost immediately. Everyone depended on a single community well managed by the HOA, and around there, whoever controlled water controlled almost everything. Now, I should probably mention something that made me different from most of my neighbors. I am a hydrologist. I have spent my career studying groundwater, aquifers, recharge systems, and the complicated ways water moves beneath our feet. So while everyone else was checking paint colors and fence rules before closing on their homes, I spent hours reading survey maps, title documents, geological reports, and property deeds. The realtor laughed and asked if I was buying a house or preparing for a court case. I laughed too because I honestly thought I was just being thorough. Looking back, those extra hours changed everything. Hidden inside one of the old deed records was language that most people would skim right over. It referenced subsurface water rights attached to the parcel decades earlier. Apparently, a previous owner had negotiated them when the area was still ranchland, but nobody had ever bothered to exercise those rights after the subdivision was built. To most buyers, those words would have been meaningless legal jargon. To me, they sounded like someone had left a safe full of cash in the basement and forgotten the combination taped to the door. I filed copies away, made notes, and went on with my life because I wasn't interested in starting trouble. In fact, I wanted the opposite. I had spent years dealing with city life and endless arguments over parking spaces and noise complaints. I wanted peace. I wanted tomatoes growing in a backyard garden, coffee on the porch at sunrise, and enough independence that I wouldn't have to argue with anyone about basic necessities. That dream led me to install a rainwater harvesting system. Nothing flashy. At least that was the plan. I hired contractors to run discrete gutters into underground pipes leading to a buried cistern capable of storing 20,000 gallons. From the surface, you could barely tell it existed except for a small maintenance hatch hidden behind a row of shrubs. The contractor looked at me and said, "That's a lot of water for one guy." I smiled and answered, "You'd be surprised how valuable preparation becomes when everyone else waits for a crisis." Spring that year was unusually wet. Every storm filled the gutters, and every drop disappeared underground into my storage system. Watching those gauges rise became strangely satisfying, almost like adding money to a savings account that couldn't be affected by inflation or politics. Meanwhile, the neighbors walked by and asked harmless questions. Mrs. Holloway from across the street wondered if I was building a storm shelter. A retired firefighter named Mike guessed it was a wine cellar. I simply told them it was a water storage project, and most nodded politely before moving on. Everyone except one person. Her name was Victoria Sloan, president of the Mesa Ridge HOA, and she had a reputation that somehow reached me before she ever introduced herself. People smiled when they said her name, but not because they liked her. It was the kind of smile people wear when remembering a dentist appointment. She finally came over one afternoon carrying a clipboard like it was a badge. Without saying hello, she looked over my fence and asked, "Did the Architectural Review Committee approve this installation?" I told her it was entirely on my property and buried underground. She responded, "Everything visible or invisible that affects community standards requires approval." I actually thought she was joking, so I laughed. She didn't. A week later, an official letter arrived stating that my rainwater collection system violated HOA design guidelines and must be removed within 30 days or I would face fines and additional enforcement actions. I read the letter twice because I couldn't believe someone was trying to tell me that collecting rain falling on my own roof somehow threatened neighborhood harmony. I called the office hoping to clear up a misunderstanding, but Victoria answered with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word compromise. "Rules exist for everyone, Mr. Carter," she said. If we allow exceptions, we lose control. That sentence stayed with me because she didn't say fairness. She didn't say safety. She said control. Something about that choice of words bothered me more than the violation notice itself. I thanked her for her time, hung up the phone, walked outside, looked at my quietly filling cistern beneath the yard, and made a decision that would eventually drag the entire neighborhood into a battle nobody saw coming. Instead of planning how to remove the system, I called the contractor back and asked a simple question that made him laugh out loud. I still remember the silence on the other end of the phone before the contractor finally said, "Daniel, are you serious?" I looked out the kitchen window at the clouds rolling over the mesas and answered, "Completely. If someone is going to find me for preparing, I might as well prepare properly." 2 weeks later, the system was larger, smarter, and far more efficient than my original design. Additional collection barrels were tucked behind privacy fencing. Underground lines connected everything into the main cistern, and a filtration system allowed me to irrigate my garden without touching a drop from the community supply. The irony was almost funny. The HOA thought they were discouraging me, but every letter they mailed only convinced me to become even more independent. Of course, Victoria Sloan interpreted my response as open defiance. Another violation notice arrived, followed by a $200 fine and a warning that continued non-compliance could result in a lien against my property. My neighbor Mike walked over while I was reading it and asked, "You gonna fight this?" I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and said, "No, I'm going to pay it." He looked confused. "That's it." I smiled. Sometimes the cheapest way to win a war is to let the other side believe they're winning. I mailed the check the same afternoon. The HOA probably celebrated. They probably thought I had accepted their authority. What they didn't know was that the canceled check bought me time, and time was worth far more than $200. Summer arrived earlier than expected, bringing weeks of relentless heat. The local weather station reported record low rainfall. Reservoirs across the county began dropping, and every forecast used words nobody wanted to hear: exceptional drought. At first, the neighborhood treated it like another inconvenience. People joked about dead lawns and expensive water bills. Then the community started producing lower volumes. Suddenly, the jokes disappeared. The HOA called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, and for the first time since moving there, I attended. The parking lot was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner of the room. Neighbors whispered nervously, and Victoria stood at the front beside a chart showing falling groundwater levels. She cleared her throat and announced, "Effective immediately, all residents will follow mandatory conservation measures. No lawn watering. No vehicle washing. Decorative fountains must remain off. Showers are limited to 5 minutes. Violations will result in escalating fines." A man in the back raised his hand and asked, "How long is this going to last?" She answered, "Until conditions improve." His wife quietly replied, "What if they don't?" Nobody answered that question. I drove home thinking about the spring storms that had quietly filled my underground storage. When I checked the gauge that evening, the cistern was nearly full. 20,000 gallons rested beneath my backyard like an insurance policy nobody else knew existed. The next morning, I watered my vegetable beds before sunrise. The tomatoes looked healthy, the peppers were thriving, and my fruit trees showed none of the stress affecting the neighborhood. A week later, everyone else's lawns had begun turning brown, while mine remained green around the garden area. Children riding bicycles slowed to stare. One afternoon, Mrs. Holloway leaned over the fence and whispered, "Daniel, are you sneaking water from somewhere?" I laughed and pointed toward the ground. "Months ago, I stored what nature gave me for free." She sighed. "I wish I'd thought of that." Unfortunately, not everyone admired preparation. Some admired suspicion instead. Rumors spread faster than weeds. By the end of the month, people claimed I had drilled an illegal well, connected secret pipes into the community system, or bribed maintenance workers to increase pressure at my house. None of it made any sense, but fear rarely needs logic to survive. One evening while watering the garden, I noticed curtains moving across the street. The next day, 2 different neighbors casually asked how often I used water. Another asked if my meter had been inspected recently. The questions sounded innocent, but they all carried the same accusation beneath the surface. Then came the knock at my front door. Victoria stood there wearing sunglasses despite the shade, holding another clipboard. Beside her stood a sheriff's deputy whose expression suggested he wished he were literally anywhere else. She didn't bother greeting me. "Mr. Carter," she announced, "we've received multiple complaints alleging unauthorized water usage during mandatory restrictions." I looked at the deputy, then back at her. "And what exactly are you accusing me of?" "Stealing community water." The deputy shifted awkwardly. I asked, "Do you have evidence?" Victoria crossed her arms. "We intend to inspect the situation." I stepped aside. "Please. I'd hate for rumors to remain rumors." Instead of taking them into the house, I walked through the backyard toward the maintenance hatch concealed behind shrubs. The deputy looked curious. Victoria looked irritated. I unlocked the cover and lifted it. Cool air drifted upward. She stared into the enormous underground chamber where water reflected sunlight like polished glass. Pumps, filters, gauges, and pipes sat neatly arranged along the walls. The deputy let out a low whistle. "That's impressive." Victoria recovered quickly. "Regardless, community restrictions apply to everyone equally." I asked, "Even if I'm not using community water?" She answered without hesitation. "Everyone must sacrifice together." I remember looking at her and realizing the argument had never been about conservation. It was about obedience. If my garden stayed alive while everyone else's died, then the HOA lost something far more valuable than water. They lost control over the narrative that everyone depended on them. After they left, Mike wandered over carrying 2 bottles of iced tea. He handed me one and said, "You know she's not going to stop." I nodded. "I know." He took a sip and asked, "So what's your move?" I looked toward the distant ridge where the setting sun painted the rocks orange and replied, "I'm done arguing about barrels and gutters. It's time to read every document they hope nobody ever reads." The following week, I contacted an attorney named Rebecca Lawson, a specialist in Western water rights whose office walls were covered with old survey maps instead of expensive artwork. She listened without interrupting while I explained the situation. When I finished, she leaned back and asked one simple question. "Do you still have the original deed language?" I slid a folder across her desk. She adjusted her glasses and spent nearly 10 minutes reading in silence. Finally, she looked up with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't excitement exactly. It was the face of someone who had just found a missing piece in a puzzle everyone else assumed was impossible to solve. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I need copies of every subdivision plat, every geological survey, every historical drilling permit, and every amendment related to this development." I frowned. "That's a lot of paperwork." She smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe it's the most expensive paperwork your HOA has ever ignored." Over the next several weeks, we assembled documents dating back decades. Old ranch boundaries, mineral reservations, groundwater studies, engineering reports, county maps, forgotten easements. Rebecca spread them across a conference table until it looked like a detective board from a crime movie. Then she traced one line with her finger and stopped. "There," she whispered. I leaned closer. The line marking my property's subsurface rights extended farther than anyone had realized. She overlaid another map showing the location of the community well. The circles overlapped almost perfectly. We checked the measurements again, then again. Finally, she looked at me and said, very quietly, "The HOA isn't simply managing a shared well. Based on these records, they appear to be extracting groundwater from an aquifer that falls within rights attached to your parcel." I stared at the maps, waiting for her to tell me she was joking. She wasn't. Months of accusations, fines, threats, and lectures suddenly looked very different. The people claiming I was taking what belonged to the community might have spent years pumping what legally belonged to me. And for the first time since this whole ridiculous conflict began, I realized the fight was no longer about protecting my rainwater system. It had become something much bigger, something that could change the future of every house in Mesa Ridge with a single ruling from a judge. Ask me to continue with part 3. Rebecca didn't celebrate when we confirmed what the documents appeared to show. She didn't pound the table or tell me we had already won. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "The law doesn't care about emotions. It cares about evidence. If these records hold up, then your HOA has a much bigger problem than your rain barrels." That sentence stayed with me during the weeks that followed. While the neighborhood argued over dying lawns and shrinking water allocations, Rebecca filed for an injunction demanding that Mesa Ridge Community Association immediately cease extracting groundwater from the disputed aquifer until ownership rights could be properly resolved. I expected months of delays, endless hearings, and expensive negotiations. Instead, the court scheduled an emergency review because the case involved an active public water supply. Suddenly, everyone who had ignored me for months wanted to know my name. The HOA attorney sent letters suggesting we settle privately. Victoria left 2 polite voicemails after spending an entire summer communicating only through violation notices. Even a few neighbors knocked on my door asking whether the rumors were true. I simply answered, "Let's see what the judge says." The hearing itself felt strangely quiet. Television dramas make courtrooms look dramatic, but real life is mostly paperwork, patient people, and uncomfortable silence. Rebecca walked the judge through old deeds, subdivision maps, historical surveys, and groundwater records with the confidence of someone explaining basic math. The HOA attorney argued that the community had relied on the well for years and that shutting it down would create unnecessary hardship. Rebecca calmly responded, "Long-term use does not automatically create ownership, especially when recorded property rights say otherwise." The judge spent several minutes reviewing exhibits without speaking. I remember hearing the air conditioning kick on because the room had become so quiet. Finally, he removed his glasses and said, "Until this matter is resolved, continued extraction presents significant legal concerns. The court grants the injunction." That was it. No dramatic speech. No shouting. Just a few sentences that changed an entire neighborhood overnight. Within 24 hours, operations at the community well stopped. The next morning, trucks carrying emergency water tanks rolled into Mesa Ridge, while confused residents gathered outside the clubhouse demanding answers. People who had barely acknowledged each other for years now stood in parking lots sharing bottled water and rumors. Local contractors quoted enormous prices for temporary supply systems, and every passing day cost the HOA thousands of dollars. Mike walked over to my porch that evening, looked at the line of tanker trucks down the road, and shook his head. "I don't think they ever imagined this." I answered honestly, "Neither did I." 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Victoria. Her voice sounded completely different from the confident woman who once lectured me about control. "Daniel, can we talk?" I agreed to meet at my house. She arrived carrying a folder instead of a clipboard, and for the first time since we met, she asked permission before entering my property. We sat at the patio table overlooking the garden she once wanted removed. She took a deep breath and said, "This situation is hurting everyone." I nodded. "It is. The association needs access to water." "I know. What would it take to settle this?" Months earlier, I probably would have argued, complained, or reminded her of every fine and threat she had sent me. Instead, I slid a sheet of paper across the table. "3 conditions," I said. "First, every fine and violation connected to my rainwater collection system disappears. Second, the HOA formally recognizes my independent water system and agrees not to interfere with it in the future. Third, the association compensates me for past extraction with a payment of $12,000. She stared at the paper for what felt like forever. Finally, she whispered, "That's all." I looked at her and answered, "I don't want revenge. I want respect for property rights." She signed the agreement with a hand that noticeably trembled. The HOA board approved the settlement shortly afterward because the alternative was even more expensive litigation while the neighborhood remained without a reliable supply. Engineers were hired to locate and drill a new well outside the disputed area, a project that eventually cost roughly $200,000. To pay for it, the association issued a special assessment to homeowners across the subdivision. Ironically, because of the settlement terms and my existing rights, I was excluded from that assessment. Some neighbors were angry at me. Others admitted privately that the board had created the disaster by refusing to compromise months earlier when the issue involved nothing more than gutters and a buried tank. Victoria resigned not long after construction began. I heard she moved to another state to live closer to family. Those stories around the neighborhood blamed everything from financial pressure to embarrassment. I honestly don't know the truth, and at this point it doesn't matter. What matters is that the lesson outlived the conflict. Today my garden still grows through the hottest months of the year. During especially dry seasons, a few neighbors ask whether they can purchase extra water from my storage system for landscaping or emergency use. I charge a modest 5 cents per gallon, enough to cover maintenance and operating costs, and I never enjoy watching anyone struggle. The strange part is that the same people who once believed I was selfish now tell new residents. If Daniel gives you advice about water, listen. Looking back, this story was never really about a cistern, an HOA, or even a courtroom. It was about what happens when authority mistakes compliance for ownership and when preparation is treated like rebellion simply because it makes someone less dependent. Some people still say I should have compromised earlier for the good of the community. Others argue the HOA got exactly what it deserved after trying to control something that legally wasn't theirs to control. So now I want to ask you, if you were in my position, would you have backed down and removed the system? Or would you have fought all the way to court knowing your neighbors might suffer because of the board's decisions? Let me know in the comments who you think was truly right, who was truly wrong, and whether justice was served or whether everyone involved paid a price for letting pride take control.